Not yet.
Okay.
Sorry, just trying to set up the computer things.
Yeah.
Too many buttons.
Sure.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Hello, Jose. How are you?
Okay. Wait for you.
Waiting for you.
Waiting for you.
Yep. All right. That's up. Pop that out. Drag it over to the other screen. There we go. Can minimize that now. And then
Hopefully my essence will bring you memories when you're in rabbinical school, or at least in the process of applying.
even just reading the little I've done so far, it reminds me a lot.
Yeah.
That's the right page. There we go.
At least that's a journey you don't have to take again.
Nope, that's one that I've done.
Exactly, and that's a blessing.
It was a good journey when I did it, but yeah, I don't need to do it again.
Exactly.
All right, technology is cooperating. I've got everything set up. Now we just wait a few minutes for other people to log in.
Also, Rabbi, can you send us the link? Oh, you're using the Sepharia, no, that you have a handout.
Yeah, no, I gave up the translation for not the translation, the commentary is very hard to put into the handout, and I was doing too much editing. And then I realized, look, we're all looking at the screen anyway. I can put it up on Sepharia. People can use it there. That's I think good, and it teaches people to use the resources that are out there.
As a matter of fact, while we're talking, I'm going to use Sepharia on my cell phone so that we can look at the screen while we talk.
So yes, we're on Eruvin chapter 5, Mishnah 1. And that's the wrong commentary. Why is that? No. Give me the correct commentary. There we are. Oh, Sepharia, I love you, but recently you've been very, very difficult. It keeps jumping from one chapter to the next. But hopefully that got it sorted out.
Let me check something really quick. I'm just curious.
Some streamers. A few more people logging on. Just give it another minute or so. It's much more sociable to be waiting for people to join when you're in the same room. It's hard when you're staring at a screen.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we've given it a nice pause. Enough time to go ahead and begin the lesson. So, welcome back, everyone. Just a little housekeeping as we prepare to do Eruvin chapter 5. This week and next week will be the last 2 weeks of class before I go on my vacation. And then so we have class this week, we have class next week, and then we will have class again in July 15th. So tonight, next week, and then pause until July 15th. I'll remind people of that next week as well. So, chapter 5. We have been talking about the Shabbat limit, the distance around your town out to which you can walk on Shabbat for a while now, but we haven't actually told people how to find it. How exactly do you measure it? It's very simple. If you're just one person standing in a field, to go 2,000 cubits each direction, and we're good. But if you're a town, how do you measure it? Most towns are not of regular size. Most towns are uneven on the edges. And so we're going to be dealing with that issue. So let's go ahead and get going. Eruvin, chapter 5, Mishnah 1. How do they make extensions for cities? Meaning for the purpose of defining the Shabbat limit. If one house recedes and another projects, or if one turret, meaning one of the large stonework parts of the wall, recedes and another projects. If there were ruins 10 handbreadths high, meaning the stones were up to 10 handbreadths, which is about a meter high or about a yard high, or there were bridges, or there were sepulchral monuments, meaning like tomb type buildings that contained dwelling places. That includes all of these. So there's partial ruins, but someone lives there. There's a bridge, but there is a toll collector who lives at the bridge. Or there is one of these tomb areas, but there is a residence in that area. Then they extend the boundary of the town to include them. And they make it, the Shabbat measure, like a square tablet in order to use in order that the use of the corners might be gained. Okay, we're going to need to draw this. It's just really no way to avoid that. Actually, we're going to start off with a circle. Let's imagine that we've got a nice generic town. And the town is basically that shape. But there are some turrets on the wall, some that go out, some that go in. There's also a house here and another house there. Maybe there's a bridge with the tax collector there. And then let's imagine that there's another point over here. We're going to find out in the next Mishnah, so spoiler alert, that the last feature has to be approximately 70 cubits close to the one before it. So you can't just say there's a house way out here. They have to be relatively close, about 100 feet or so from one to the next, to still be included in the zone. So with that in mind, let's get rid of our outlier. With that in mind, we have to then decide, how do we measure the borders of this town? Where do we start measuring 2,000 amot out from in order to actually have the measure of the town? Well, you might have been inclined to think we just measure the circle, right? That's the main town, and all these other things, they're within the 2,000 limit anyway, so why should we have to extend the town hypothetical border and then measure out from them? Let's just do it of the circle. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says very clearly, and you'll pardon me for my not clear initial drawing, I will try and tidy this up, that basically you measure the town. Let me get to my select button. You measure the town, come on, so that all of these little extra bits are included to the furthest extent at any point. All right, so even though, go to Spotlight, even though way down here, there's nothing, right? The last point was this little house way up here. We're gonna draw a straight line down until we reach the edge of this bottom one. And we don't duck in just because a tower was a bit closer. We take it from the furthest point, and this furthest point, and this furthest point, and you make a square out of all of the furthest points on any given side. Obviously, this is technically a rectangle. And that is the basis of your city. And then, now that you've got that, you draw your 2,000 amot around it. So if I live in the city, I can walk all the way out to here, and there, and there, and there. The basic shape of the city is decided by all of these extra features. Again, as long as they are close to each other, roughly about 70 cubits. And then you take the furthest point on each of the four sides, box it off, and then measure your 2,000 cubits from that outward to be the Shabbat limit. All right, Aaron, hand up. What do you got?
Yes, Robert. Does the 2,000 cubits, does that go from the actual structure or the property line? Sorry, 170 cubits. Because that would, it seems like that would prevent somebody from having a farm outside the city limits.
Well, that doesn't prevent them from having the farm. It just would prevent them from extending the city reach beyond the farm. So, you know, let's imagine, we'll change my stamp. Let's imagine that that's my farm. If that's my farm, I can still go to my farm on Shabbat. That's okay.
Right.
But if I have my house in the town and then I go out to the farm and do whatever I'm visiting on the farm, because most of the stuff I can't do on Shabbat, but let's just say I want to go out and, you know, wave at the chickens. I can still go out on Shabbat, no problem. But the city's not going to measure its borders from my farm. It's going to measure it from the last structure. The rabbis really wanted it to be measured from the last structure within the city chain, not from the last residential structure, not just the last thing that was associated with someone in the town.
Right.
So yeah, it's definite residential structures. It is not property.
Yeah, I just thought they lived on the farm.
Some people do and some people don't. You know, and how close the farm was to the town would then make a big determination. A lot of people preferred not to live on a farm. That's one of the reasons why we have Sukkot. Remember, the sukkah was a farmer's hut. It wasn't a normal residence for the average person. The average person would live in the city, well, village, at night, mostly for safety's sake, and then they would go out to the farm. And during the big harvest seasons, they would make a little sukkah in the farm, and then they would sleep there during the harvest days so they could start and finish as late as possible. Well, start early and finish late. It's not like the American homestead vision of a farm where there's like one farm every 20 miles. It was people lived in the town and then would go out to the farms to work. And that was also common in many parts of European farming as well during like the Middle Ages. Any other questions on this section of the Mishnah? Okay, let me just find my clear button. Where'd my clear button? There it is. And we will, oh, I'm still on stamp. Stop that. And we will roll on. Mishnah 2. They give a karpaf, an extension of every town, the words of Rebbe Meir. All right, what's he saying here? Well, I'm afraid it is back to the drawing board. So we have our town. I wish I could do this precisely. And he is advocating that there be a buffer zone of a karpaf, which is 70 cubits and a fraction, that would be extended beyond the outside of the town. So you'd have the town itself, and then even if there were no other structures outside the town, or even if there were some structures, beyond the last structure, there would be an additional 70 cubits given, an additional karpaf, an additional buffer zone before you began to measure. That was Rabbi Meir's position. His argument comes from the idea of the outward area that was given to the Levite cities, like we mentioned before. But the sages say they add that they said the ava, that doesn't make any sense. They said with regards to the karpaf that this is only in regard to two towns, that if there was to this one a piece of land 70 cubits and a fraction, and to the other one a piece of land of 70 cubits and a fraction, they can consider the karpaf as combining the two into one. Okay, so what they're talking about here is what would happen if you had two cities. Let's get over here, right? And around each city, you had your Tehum, you had your Shabbat boundary. Just imagine I'm drawing this actually accurate. This is not drawn precisely. And imagine that the two boundaries came so close that if, let me get to select, if you had for each of the towns 70 cubits that you could add as a buffer, meaning you had 140 some cubits between them, that they would actually touch, then you might as well treat it like it's one town for Shabbat, which means somebody who lived in this town could walk all the way to this part, and somebody who lives in this town could walk all the way to that part. That they were willing to give a little buffer if it would help two towns join together for the Shabbat limit. But they weren't saying give a buffer for every town always. Do we see the difference between the two opinions?
Yeah, Rabbi, that would be 4,140 cubits between them, right?
From the furthest limit of each one. From all the way over here on, well, it's the left on my screen, which I guess would be the west, and all the way to the far end, which I guess would be the east. You would, if you wanted to, you could get up in the morning, walk to this end, turn around and walk all the way through one town, past the other town, and to the other end of the other town. And that would be 4,000 plus 141 and a third cubits.
But doesn't each town get 2,000 square feet in every direct, or 2,000 cubits in every direction? So the one has 2,000 going right, the other one has 2,000 going.
Sorry. Yes, between the two towns, there would be 4,000. You're right. Between the two towns, there could be up to 4,000 cubits. Obviously, if there's less than that, then you don't need the buffer. They become one zone for Shabbat anyway. But you're right. Depending upon how big each town was, you would have 2,000 cubits on the opposite sides as well. So you'd have 8,000 plus cubits plus the actual distance of the towns that you could stroll around on for Shabbat. You know, because it's important to get your exercise in, because people in the ancient world didn't walk enough. They walked plenty, of course. All right, make sense? Okay, I'm going to leave that diagram there because we're going to need it for just a second. Oops, I rolled too far. Come on, there we are. So also, 3 villages arranged in the shape of a triangle, if between the two outer ones there is a distance of 141 and a third cubits, that's our buffer stripe, the middle one causes all 3 of them to be regarded as one. So what they're basically saying is, we've got town A, we've got town B. What happens, excuse me, what happens if we've got town C, right? And town C is in between the two of them. And do we then say that the territory extends to cover all 3 of them as one or not? And the answer is that if town C is in that in-between place and also not too far from the other 2 towns, meaning within that same basic territory, that if you were to turn our buffer zone on its side, it would also be close enough to the other 2 towns, then all the residents of all 3 towns have the entire huge area as their Shabbat space for walking. Everyone follow the geometry there? Right, even though you're going to end up with a huge, huge zone, you still do it this way if all three of them happen to be close enough in this triangular structure.
What happens if the third town's more towards the right or left?
As long as it's within the appropriate distance for each of the other two towns, as long as it is a partner in the amount of space between them, then it would still be. So if I took this town and put it like, that, as long as the distance between this town and this town is still within the appropriate amount, we could even go like that, then we would be okay. But if this town
is even more toward the right,
this town is over here, then these two towns would be joined, and these two towns would be joined, but this town and this town would not be. Okay. Where's my mouse? There's my mouse. Okay. So the next one, I don't think will take too much drawing. So let's see if I can rest the mouse for a bit. Just a second. How do you actually do the measuring? Has anybody here ever done any construction work? No one? No one's ever built a deck or put in new cabinets? How about, bought a sofa from IKEA and you weren't sure if it was going to fit in your house? Has anybody here ever used a tape measure in their life? Okay, I got at least one hand raised on screen. Okay, so if you've ever used a tape measure, or even a ruler, but trying to be careful, you may have noticed that the way you hold it makes a difference, right? The distance between point A and point B, if they're level, and between point A and point B, if one is higher than the other, that makes a different line between the two. So in order to measure the distance out from each town, they needed to have a set of guidelines. So that's what Mishnah 4 is trying to give us. They measure the Shabbat limit only with a rope of 50 cubits long, neither less, no more. The Gemara explains this is because if you have a shorter rope, then when you're pulling on it, it's going to stretch, right? Because a shorter rope would be of weaker material, there'd be more give in it, and that would mean that the rope could stretch. And if you stretch it, then your measurement is going to be too long. If it's too long, on the other hand, if you have a heavy rope, then anybody here who's ever tried to pull a heavy rope between two people knows that it's really, really hard because the bottom part of the rope wants to sag, right? That's why when you look at the power lines that run along between the poles, they always dip in the middle, right? It's very, very hard to pull a rope tight enough without breaking it so that it'll be perfectly level once the rope reaches a certain length, right? There's a whole complicated materials engineering formula for all that good stuff. But basically, it means that the rabbi settled on a 50 cubit rope. That a 50 cubit rope, about 75 feet, that's about what, 25 meters, that would be the right length that two people could hold it. It wouldn't overly sag in the middle, and it wouldn't stretch overly either when being pulled on by the two people. Everyone understand the logic? Okay. And one should measure only while holding the end of the rope on level with his heart. Meaning you don't put the rope on the floor and the other guy holds it up at his head. And you don't put it on your head while the other guy holds it on the floor. Each person should be holding it roughly at center chest level. Everyone got that? All right, that way you minimize the angle of the rope, which means that you are getting a more accurate measure of your 50 cubits. If he was measuring and he reached a valley or a wall, he spans it and resumes his measuring. All right. So again, if you've ever tried to measure, you guys have all seen people or used one yourself, those little measuring wheels on a stick, right? You roll it along the sidewalk or and it'll every time it goes around, it measures 1 meter or 1 yard or something like that. I'll take it from your silence that you all know what I'm talking about. Well, if you were measuring and you went down a hill and up a hill and then back out, or if you went over a hill and down a hill, then your measurement would be longer than if you were able to fly straight ahead and not deviate, right? Because the actual perimeter, because of the valley, is longer than if you built a bridge between them, right? A straight line is shorter than following the contours. So what the rabbis are saying here is that the Shabbat limit doesn't follow the contours, it goes like the crow. So therefore, if there's a little ditch, you hold the rope on either sides and you don't worry about accommodating the distance that you go down and the distance you come up. You only care about the distance across. And the same for a wall. You don't put the rope so that it bends over the wall, because the rope would be shorter, meaning your boundary would be closer if you had that deviation of going up over the wall with your rope. So instead, you measure up to the wall, you measure the thickness of the wall, and then you measure from the other side going on. Make sense? Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
if you're using a rope and you measure up to the wall, if it's only halfway through, do you just estimate that this is about halfway, so 2/3 of 50 cubits?
You mean if the rope doesn't dead end precisely at the wall?
Yes.
Right. No, then they would actually measure how much of the rope was left that was not eaten by the wall. And then,
What did they?
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what did they measure with? Was the rope marked with cubits, every 1 cubit every cubit?
There were a number of different ways to measure the excess. So some ropes would often have markings. Other smaller ropes, as we're going to see in a later Mishnah, could also be used to measure the bigger rope. But yes, we are now spoiled for all of our laser measuring and survey tools and all of that. This was the best they did.
Was that part of the previous Mishnah where they said none of the measurements are exact? For going past the Shabbat line, if you're a little bit past, it's like, well, it's just an estimate anyways?
Yes, when we talked last week, yes, about that. And we're also going to see that that also becomes important in the next Mishnah about what happens if you have differing opinions about where the limit is. Okay, and again, if you reach a hill, you span it, meaning you don't measure the up and down, you measure how much it would be through, because it's not like going up the hill should eat up my Shabbat walk distance. It's how far away from the city, not how far up. But provided he does not go beyond the Shabbat limit. Okay, so this took a bit of research to try and figure out exactly what they were saying here, because in typical Mishnah fashion, they don't go into a lot of explanation. So the issue is, like we talked about before, is you're measuring out from the side of the city, from the furthest point of the town. But obviously natural features are not even. They don't, actually, you know what? I thought I didn't have to draw, but I think I'm going to have to. All right, so that's my town. Let's make my town smaller. That's my town, and I'm trying to measure things out of it. But there's a valley over there. And I need to know where my limit is. All right, let's move that a little closer so you can see that it overlaps the valley a little bit. How about like that? There, all right, that'll work. So the problem is, how do I measure accurately if I can't quite get to the other side of the valley without leaving the zone? It's too far. Well, I can go here where it's still the other side of the valley and reach it. So even if I started off measuring from this point, I can go down, right, and resume on an area that's outside the valley, so that because the valley is narrower at this point, or at least relative to my direction, and get my bearing that's going to be my vertical line. Does that make sense for everyone? The problem becomes, I don't know if I can do this because this is still fiddly. It'd be much easier with a whiteboard. The problem becomes what happens. Actually, let's move it like that. And we're going to need one more line. Bear with me. What happens if, in order to get around the valley, I actually have to go outside the other boundary? Right? Again, you're going to have to just imagine the valley looks a little different than it does. Right? Sorry, I can't just erase it that easily. So instead of deviating just a little bit and getting my bearings, I have to deviate down to here to get my bearings and find my line to go up with. Well, if that was the case, then don't. Find another way to measure. Because if you step outside the boundary, then people are going to think that this area is also included. If they see the measurers out there with the rope outside what would eventually become the real limit, in this case, the southern limit, then they're going to assume that this area is also okay. So you have to find a way to measure it where you would stay inside the overall limits on all four sides the whole time you're measuring. Make sense? Okay. If he is unable to span it in connection, in connection with this, Rabbi Dostai ben Yanai stated in the name of Rabbi Meir, I have heard they pierce the hills. All right, so one of the options you can use, imagine this is a mountain rather than a valley, is they worked out a system with a short 4-cubit rope. 4 cubits is about 6 feet. And one person would hold it at their head, and the other person would hold it at their feet as they went up the mountain. And that way they would keep it as close as they could, on a gentle slope at least, to being straight. And when they reach their 50 amot, or when they reach the limit of Shabbat, the 2000 amot, that is where they would mark it. So they did allow for some granulation, pixelation, if you will, for measuring up slopes if they had to, but they preferred to measure it flat as long as it didn't mean going outside the whole area. So you see, you can get a whole bunch of information about how to do a landscape survey by studying Mishnah. All right, moving on. Mishnah 5. They measure the Shabbat limit only through an expert. All right, I know you all feel like experts now because we just talked about it, but you have to actually be an expert in order to measure the Shabbat limit. Because if you're not an expert and you get it wrong, people are going to be violating Shabbat. So experts only for this, please. If he extended the limit at one point and limited at another, they observe the place where he extended it. There's a lot of discussion about how to interpret this particular passage. The explanation that I think works very well is if the person comes and says, I know you thought the Shabbat limit was here, but in fact, let's get my hand ready to the camera, but the Shabbat limit is a little closer to your town. And you're all like, oh, well, yes, we have to, we make sure we're going to observe Shabbat. So now we'll use the new shorter limit. But if you are willing to accept him when he says it's shorter, then when on the other side of the city, he says it's further than you thought it was, you have to accept that as well. Meaning both what is stringent and what is lenient, that's not important. What's important is where did the expert actually make the mark? And if it's further than you thought it was, fine, use the area that he gave you. If it's less than you thought it was, fine, you've lost some area you thought you had. But following the expert's measurement is how you make sure you do this right. Just being more careful and always taking the smaller measurement that you thought it was or what the expert said it was is not the appropriate behavior. We're going to see a little bit more on that in just a second. Now, if there was one who made it a greater distance and one who made it a lesser distance, meaning you've got two experts, and one says it's here and that's further away than the one who says it's here, which is closer to the town, the greater distance is observed. If you've got two experts, again, they have to be experts, not just random people with a tape measure, and one of them says it is further than where the other one says, you take the larger version. Even a slave, even a female slaves, and these are non-Jewish slaves, I should point out, are believed when they say thus far is the Shabbat limit. Normally, we wouldn't take testimony of slaves. Normally, we wouldn't take testimony for Jewish matters from non-Jews, but they do accept their testimony. If they say this is where the limit was the last time the expert was here, that is where the limit is. Since the sages did not enact the law in order to be strict, but in order to be lenient, right? They weren't trying to create the idea of a tehum as something to make your life bad. They were trying to create a buffer that you could travel in. The restriction was only de Rabbanan. It was only of a rabbinic restriction at all. And therefore, they are perfectly allowed to be a little bit more lenient, a little bit more generous in how the interpretation of its final location is. All right, questions or comments on that section? No one's going to comment about how the rabbis loved being lenient? All right, of course, because they weren't loving being lenient. They were lenient because it was appropriate to be lenient in this case. As I've said 1,000 times, and we'll probably say it 1,000 more times, doing what is right for the moment, for the case, is what's important. It's not about shoehorning it into your own preferred agenda. All right, scrolling down. So we've been talking about the extending or the measuring of the area around your city, and that's called the Eruv. But there was another Eruv as well, as we talked about way back at the beginning, and that's the Eruv where you blend together the courtyards, the houses of the people in a town, to allow them to actually carry within that territory, not for just walking, but actual carrying. We are now going to jump into a Mishnah that deals with that topic with no warning. Lots of discussion among the commentaries about how this Mishnah got here and all the editing that put it here, but that's not important for us. But what is important for us is understanding a couple of basic topics. We're going to deal with this type of Eruv more in later chapters, but you need to know a little bit about a very special case for understanding this one. And that's to say, if you live in a city, and this is in case, this city means it's a walled city. If you live in a city that is owned entirely by one person, right? It is the town of Neely. And I own the whole town, and I rent all of the residences in the town out to people. Then you can make an Eruv that includes the entire city, meaning everyone can carry with everyone. On the other hand, if the city is not my city, but is instead owned piece by all of the residents, the rabbi said you can't make one Eruv for everyone. There has to be some part of the city that is not included. Because if you make it for everyone, then people will forget that without an Eruv, you're not supposed to be carrying. So you had to reserve, you had to have a little piece undone, unincluded, the non-incorporated territory, in order that people would value and appreciate and understand what the Eruv was actually doing. There had to be some part you couldn't carry into or out of if you were in that zone. With that in mind, Mishnah 6 is going to talk to us about what happens if you have a city that changes from public to private ownership or from private to public ownership. Everyone up to speed on like the sudden topic change? Great. If a town that belonged to an individual was converted into one belonging to the many, they may make an eruv for the entire town. So basically, because it was already one person's territory and had the ability to have an eruv for the whole town, even though it's changed status of ownership, you can still treat it as though it was one private property and make an eruv that covers 100% of the territory. But if a town belonged to the many and was converted into one belonging to an individual, they may not make an eruv for the entire town unless they exclude from it a section the size of the town of Charashah in Judea, which contains 50 residents. The words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says 3 courtyards, each of which contains 2 houses. So what they're saying is that if you go from a public town to a privately owned town, you can't treat it like a privately owned town for extending an eruv to 100% of the residents. Both of these positions are very consistent, which is if it's already been seen and treated as being private, then you're allowed to continue that. But if it was already seen and treated as though it were public and had a limitation, you can't undo that when you make it private, because people will think that people are now carrying in a public city as though it were private. So it creates a sense of confusion and the chance for a violation. Now, the territory that they're talking about with this Charashah area of Judea, and they're arguing between 50 people or 3 courtyards of 2 houses. Spoiler alert, if you look through the Gemara, they actually end up with 1 courtyard, 1 house, 1 person. That's the actual minimum that needs to be set aside. Natan, were you going to ask or say something?
That question, exactly what you answered now. So
I thought so.
It's 1 house, 1 courtyard.
Exactly. As long as there is 1 outside, then everyone else can be inside.
And who decides who is the outsider?
Well,
because that person will not be very happy.
Well, it depends on how much they want to carry in and out of the zone. So I actually have not seen a discussion of how you decide who is going to be in that system. Personally, if it were up to me, I would say, well, find the person for whom this is their vacation house, right? If they don't live in the town all the time, make it the guy who's just owning this for a property investment. No offense to property investors. And let everybody who actually lives here 24/7, let them enjoy the rest of the eruv.
And can be a not you, the house that is out of the field, of the roof?
That's a very good question. I don't remember precisely. Off the top of my head, I would say that yes, because the idea is that you are excluding a zone. There's going to be a discussion about whether or not a non-Jew who refuses to participate in an eruv invalidates the eruv of your courtyard, but that's for a later chapter. Aaron?
Yeah, so basically, does the status of the city at the time it's created remain the status in perpetuity then?
Well, or until it is, destroyed, conquered, reformed, and many of the other things that can happen to a city that will give it a chance to change its identity. If everybody leaves the city because of expulsion, and the status of the city is no longer in people's minds, then it becomes essentially a new blank slate.
But as long as it's a continuous city, then it keeps its status in perpetuity?
Because otherwise the people will remember, and when they remember wrong, they'll end up having possible transgressions. Okay, moving on to Mishnah 7, scrolling carefully. If one was in the east and said to his son, prepare for me an eruv in the west, or if he was in the west and he said to his son, prepare for me an eruv in the east, if the distance between him and his house was no more than 2,000 cubits, and that between him and his eruv was more than this, he is permitted to go to his house, but forbidden to go to his eruv. Okay. I'm afraid it is time for another drawing. Everyone loves my artwork in this class. This is like the worst Masechet to not have a whiteboard for. Okay, so you've got your basic town. And around the town, you have your basic Tehum, the basic Shabbat boundary. And then we've got a guy. We're going to put him here, and we're going to put his son over there. And I'm going to move him around some. So let's imagine he starts off actually inside the Shabbat border, but he wants to go that direction. He wants to go east during Shabbat, which, remember, if you put your Eruv on the border of the east, that will move the whole Eruv that way, giving you the extra 2,000 cubits on the far side of the city. Everyone remembers that, yes? Okay, so the question becomes, that part is all very clear. If his son goes, his son makes it, then yes, he gains the Eruv. But what happens if he, clicking the wrong thing. No, don't give me the heart, right? So what happens if he is not close enough to be part of the main zone, right? If the distance between him and his house is no more than 2,000 cubits, just a second, right? No, let's pick a better color than that, right? His house is there, right? And between the two of them, it's only 2,000 cubits. Imagine it's a big city, right? Then that's fine, because he is considered to be home by the time he is here. But if his house, go back to select. If his house was way over there, and by the time Shabbat begins, the beginning of dusk, he's not close enough to it to allow it to be used to reset where his son has gone to put the new Eruv, then he's out of luck. But it's okay. He doesn't gain the extra that he was hoping for. He doesn't get that, but he does get the regular Eruv for the town. So now he can go anywhere in the town that he would normally go on a Shabbat, but he doesn't get the extra, not over there.
So he cannot visit the son, but yes, he can go to the home.
Oh, no, he can visit the son, because the son, remember, put the Eruv at the edge of the Tehum, or close to the edge. So the son can still come home, no problem, because the son never left the area. He was just placing the Eruv over here. He can come back. Everything is fine. But of course, because the son had placed it there, but the father wasn't close enough to validate it, wasn't close enough to, what's the right term, like kickstart it, make it, initiate it, initialize it, right? He didn't get close enough when Shabbat was finishing to make it come into effect. Then it's as though the kid did nothing. So
it's a win-win situation. Everyone wins.
Everyone wins, but he doesn't get the extra territory. He doesn't get his extra zone. He wanted the extra 2,000 cubits. He didn't get that. But he's not punished for anything. He didn't lose, for example, the other side over here. So he just is now like a normal resident of the city. As we talked about a little bit last week, the rabbis interpret this because when it's in a position like this, then it's clear his intent would be to be a member of the city, right? He's not going to want to be a member of the no man's land over here. He wants to be part of the town. His house is there. That would be his expectation. So they make an assumption about his intention, and they grant him the Eruv, the normal Eruv, as a matter of course. Okay, if the distance to his Eruv was no more than 2,000 cubits, and that to his house more than this, he is forbidden to go to his house, but permitted to go to his Eruv. So if his Eruv was 2,000 cubits away from him, but it was more than that to his house, then he can't get to the house. Right? He can get to the area around the Eruv, and that becomes his new station, and he has his little box around the Eruv. But he wouldn't be able to get to his house if his house was more than 2,000 cubits away.
Yeah, but the family can visit him outside where he's now standing.
Right, and you have to remember that the Eruv that he would have will overlap the city. So it's not like he has to live in the countryside.
Correct.
Okay, one who puts his Eruv within the extension of a town, he has done nothing, right? If you take your Eruv, we're going to use this one. Oh, keep clicking the thing. Okay, if you take your Eruv and you put it here, you didn't gain anything. Your Eruv has to actually go outside the edge of the town before it begins to shift your Tichum. If he put it even 1 cubit only beyond the limit, he loses what he gains. So if I put it here, then I move the Eruv like that. All right, if I put it there, I move the Eruv like that. Whatever you gain, you lose on the opposite side. Okay. Drawings cleared for Mishnah 7. On to Mishnah 8. You know what? I think we might just be able to get both of them done tonight. Get a whole chapter in one night. Not bad. Just a second. But we are going to have to draw again. The people of a large town may walk through the whole of a small town, but the people of a small town may not walk through the whole of a large town. All right, we're going to do a little Venn diagramming here. And just for clarity's sake, we're going to make the town circle and their territory squares. So
something very similar in the past, no?
Not quite, not quite. Let me explain what's going on here. I'll try and draw these in a way that actually fit. I may have to adjust, so bear with me. All right, so the large town, of course, has a large Tichum. Oh, there we go. That technically should be bigger than that in order to get in the proper scale. You're just gonna have to trust me that it's big enough that it takes in the area around the small town. But the small town, oops, its area is just around it. Let's say, see, this is what happens when you try and draw things on the fly with a mouse. Let's, all right, so obviously I'm not doing my best drafting work ever here. What you need to imagine, am I gonna be able to do that? All right. Ignore, let's just say there's things built up on the edge of the town. It's complicated as enough as it is without trying to draw this with a mouse. Okay. Little town has its Eruv that partially goes in to a big town. Big town has its Eruv that goes entirely over the territory of the small town. Everyone see the difference? If I live in the big town, I can go to the little town and walk anywhere I feel like in the town. If I'm from the little town and I go to the big town, I can only walk in the territory that is the appropriate 2,000 cubits away from the edge of my town. I don't gain access to the entirety of the town. Make sense? How is this so? Okay, so there is another debate on this section that this how is it so is a interpolation. The Gemara tries to figure out something is missing here in the Mishnah. And so they try to deduce what they were actually talking about in a missing sentence. And the missing sentence is basically that a person might want to put their Eruv into another town that was close to their town within the 2,000 cubits. With that in mind, let's continue reading. If a man was in a large town and deposited his Eruv in a small town, or if he stayed in a small town and deposited his Eruv in a large town, he may walk through all the town and 2,000 cubits beyond it. Okay, well, before we get to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, let's make sure we get the general one. So I'm living in the small town. my normal Eruv ends in the big town. So I put my Eruv at that border. I now gain access to the entire town and its Eruv on the other side. Right? I don't just gain 2,000 cubits from my town. I gain this town and its Eruv as well.
Why?
Why? Because by putting your Eruv in a place, you become like a resident of the place.
So that is benefit the small town.
Very much, exactly, very much. And it benefits the big town if they didn't overlap as much as this. Right? If the overlap wasn't so complete, if they were each half and half overlap, it would benefit the big town person too.
So it's better for the people to build small towns very near big cities.
You mean suburbs?
Yes.
And what do we have? We have suburbs.
No, but today, but I'm saying the time of the Mishnah. Because in this way, for Shabbat, they could overlap and they could go to the big city and have a huge Eruv.
And indeed, I mean, not just because of Eruvin, I don't think, but historically that was normal. You would have a large city in a region and many small towns would be clustered nearby to use the farmland, the forest, and the rivers and things like that. So yeah, not everybody lived in a big city. Once the city reached a certain size, people would start forming small towns in the area. And this certainly would encourage it. Now, Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva says he has only the place of his Eruv and another 2,000 cubits, meaning, no. You put your Eruv here in the city, everyone can see my cursor, right? You only gain an additional 2,000 cubits beyond that. You don't gain everything else in the town. That doesn't work.
And the halacha is by Rabbi Akiva.
Nope, Rabbi Akiva loses.
Really? For me, it makes more sense Rabbi Akiva. Because the other one are abusing the system.
No, they're not abusing the system. They are, they are remembering, since the sages did not enact the law in order to be strict, but in order to be lenient. Back in Mishnah 5. Right? You're not abusing a system if the system was designed to give you more permission. Right? If I have a class and the teacher says it's an open book test and you can bring in any books you want, if I bring in 40 books, I'm not abusing the system. The teacher said I could bring in books.
Yeah.
And yes, as a teacher, you would know that anyone who needs 40 books is never going to be able to find the information they need. The point is that you're not abusing a system if the system was designed to be lenient, that is its purpose, is to be lenient. Not completely open, but to be as lenient as possible while still maintaining some valid feeling of having a limitation. All right, so Mishnah 9 to wrap it up. Rabbi,
but that leniency go against the rationalization, because the rational is to play with the 2,000 and more. And when you are so lenient, you are going against the standard that you try to create in order to make the system work.
No, but the standard, and this is going to become even more important when we get to the partnership Eruvin, the Shitufim, because of it's about being connected to a group, to another person, about being blended together with them. It's about where is your residence, and your residence is marked by the food. So if I put my food in your town, I'm a resident of the town. And that means I get the benefits of being a resident of that town. It may sound symbolic, but that is what it's trying to symbolize, is that joining of one person with another group in order that they can all share a broader benefit.
And what happens if you leave the food in the other town, and when you want to come back on Shabbat, someone ate your food, and the food is no more there?
So once the
roof doesn't exist more?
No. Once the Eruv has been created, it is good for the rest of Shabbat, like we talked about in one of the earlier chapters.
Doesn't mean if someone already ate your food.
You can eat your food. Once the Eruv begins, once it has been initiated for Shabbat, it's good. Now, nowadays, just a little bit of a flashback because I happened to be going through my photos from Israel just the other day. Nowadays, most people will leave the food for a very long time. They're not going to eat it and replace it each week. And I came across one of the photos I took from Joseph Caro Synagogue in Tzfat, and they had a little box with a piece of matzah in it, and it was labeled as the Eruv matzah. So it was clear that it was sitting there for quite some time.
Okay.
But technically, yes, you can eat it. All right, so number 9, Rabbi Akiva is going to fight back. He wants to push on this. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "Do you not agree with me that one who puts his Eruv in a cave may walk no further than 2,000 cubits from the place of his Eruv?" Meaning, he has his Eruv, he puts it in the mouth of a cave. He can walk into the cave another 2,000 amot, another 2,000 cubits, and that's it. And they replied, "When is this true?" Meaning, yes, but only where no people dwell in it, in the cave. But where people dwell in it, one may walk through the whole of it and 2,000 cubits beyond it. If the cave is a little village cave, then it's now a city. And within that city, you have free access to any part of that city. And when you exit on the other end, you can go an additional 2,000 cubits beyond the limits of that city. And thus, where an Eruv is put within the cave, the law is more lenient than where one is put on top of it. Meaning that if you put it on top of the cave, where no one is living, now you're only gaining territory. You put it in the cave where people live, you're gaining the town. You're gaining that entire area. And to the measurer of whom they spoke, they gave him a distance of 2,000 cubits, even if the end of his measure terminates within a cave. Right? So yes, if they are measuring in that place and it terminates in the cave, then yes, he does get those 2,000 cubits. And that finishes up chapter 5. Chapter 6 will begin next week. Deals with the binding together of people for the courtyard type Eruv and how that works, which we'll be dealing with for a while now. But again, a reminder that next week is the last class before I go on vacation. Following next week's class, we will then resume on July 15th. So one more class, a break, and then July 15th. Everyone good? Thank you all very much for coming and studying. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
Rabbi.